They thought he was just another forgotten veteran, a man scraping by on day wages, sleeping in a broken-down stable, with nothing left but a scarred body and a black horse no one else could tame. But the night the desert split open, everything changed. Drawn by his horse into a valley, no map had ever marked Jonah. Mercer stumbled upon a massive, half-buried disk of silver metal, silent, ancient, and not of this earth. And inside, sealed in the cold dark, waited a secret so staggering it could shatter the world's illusions, or destroy him for uncovering it. From that moment on, Jonah's life was no longer his own. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The Nevada mountains were a barren stretch of earth where the desert winds carried dust like knives and the horizon shimmered with heat. The land seemed to reject life, offering only jagged, stone-dry sagebrush and the endless hiss of sand moving against itself. In the midst of this harsh emptiness stood a weather-beaten horse barn, long abandoned by its owner, now serving as the shelter of a man who had nothing else left to call home. Jonah Mercer lived there, a man in his late 40s, whose body carried the map of wars and years of disappointment. He walked with a limp that flared each time the weather turned cold, a limp earned from shrapnel lodged too close to bone to ever be removed. His frame was wiry, his shoulders bent under invisible weight. Life had thinned him out, pared him down, until only the stubborn essence of survival remained. The townsfolk who saw him rarely thought of him as a veteran. To them, he was only a drifter who scraped by in the margins, too poor to matter, too broken to climb back. The barn was all he had. Its roof leaked when rare desert rains came, and its boards groaned with every gust of wind. The smell of rot mingled with hay, long since turned to dust. At night, the stars slipped through the cracks of the roof and fell onto Jonah's weary face. Yet for him, this ruin was a fortress of sorts. It kept out the world that had discarded him. Within these splintered walls, there was no judgment, no pitying stares, only the silence of wood and the steady presence of the animal that was his only companion. By day, Jonah walked the dusty trail into town, searching for whatever work would keep hunger from gnawing too deeply. The jobs were never kind, hauling crates for the grocer, hammering broken fence posts for ranchers, digging trenches under the sun until his skin blistered and his old wound screamed. He was paid in coins so few he often wondered if the effort outweighed the reward. Yet he took them without complaint. He never argued over wages or demanded more. Men twice his age earned pity for their frailty. Jonah earned only shrugs, sometimes sneers. People in town recognized him, but not kindly. They whispered about his limp, his silence, the shadowed look in his eyes. Mothers pulled their children aside when he passed. Bartenders served him last, if at all. No one asked where he had been before he came to this stretch of Nevada, and Jonah never volunteered it. He had fought under flags and orders that no longer mattered. He had given years to a country that had no place for him once he returned. Now he was simply the poor veteran who fixed fences and kept to himself. But when he left the town behind and walked back toward the barn, the weight of their stares faded. Because waiting for him, there was Shadow. The horse was a massive black stallion, shoulders broad as a wall, hooves the size of Jonah's hands. The animal's eyes glimmered with a cold fire, sharp and distrustful of anyone who dared come near. Once at an auction, the ranchers had laughed at the beast, called him a monster, unbreakable, dangerous. No rider could tame him, they said. That was why Jonah could buy him for nearly nothing. But Shadow had not thrown Jonah, not even once. When they first locked eyes, the horse had stilled ears, flicking back, as though recognizing something kindred in the broken man who reached for his lead rope. Since then, Shadow followed Jonah with the wary loyalty of a soldier who had found his last commander. The two of them mirrored one another, Jonah the outcast man and Shadow the outcast beast. Each had been branded dangerous, unwanted. Each had been left to rot on the edges of the world. Together, they found something resembling home. At night, Jonah kindled small fires inside the barn. The light flickered across warped boards, chasing away the cold. He would lean back against the wall, chew through hard bread or stale jerky, and wash it down with a swig of cheap whiskey. Across from him, Shadow would lower himself onto the ground, stretching out his legs with the heavy sigh of an animal at ease. The horse's breathing filled the barn, slow and steady, and for Jonah, that sound was more comforting than any lullaby he had known as a boy. Sometimes Jonah spoke to him, voice low and gravelly from years of shouting commands and swallowing dust. "Just you and me, Shadow," he would murmur, half to the horse and half to himself. "That's enough." The horse would flick his ears, thump his tail against the ground, and Jonah would almost believe that the words had been heard and understood. Those nights were the closest thing to peace Jonah ever knew. The desert outside could rage with wind. His body could ache with the memory of wounds, but in the circle of firelight, he let his guard drop. He would close his eyes and for a while forget the battlefield, forget the town, forget the silence of people who had turned their backs. Yet when the fire burned low and the cold crept in again, the past returned. Pain was the constant reminder. Each time the temperature dropped, his leg throbbed with the sharp bite of the metal still buried deep within him. He would rub at the scar, absent-mindedly, jaw clenched, the ache carrying him back to nights long ago when he had lain bleeding in the dirt of foreign soil, waiting for help that never came fast enough. And with the pain came memory. He remembered the faces of men who had not come home, men who had followed orders into fire and chaos, only to be left behind in smoke. He remembered the voices of officers shouting commands that meant nothing but death. He remembered the silence that followed the silence that lasted longer than any battle. Jonah had once had a family. A wife who had loved him before the war, had carved him hollow, a daughter whose laughter had been the one pure sound in his world. But poverty and the weight of his broken mind had driven them away. The marriage crumbled under the pressure of Bill's unpaid nights spent staring at walls and his inability to step back into the life of ordinary men. He did not blame them for leaving. Now all that remained was Shadow. The horse did not ask questions, did not flinch at nightmares, did not leave when Jonah woke screaming in the dark. Shadow was there, steady and real, anchoring Jonah to the world when his own mind threatened to unravel. The day had begun with heat. Nevada had a way of pressing the sun into a man's skin until it felt like he was being slowly baked alive. By late afternoon, the air itself seemed to waver, the ground shimmering like glass under the weight of light. Jonah Mercer sat outside the barn with a hammer and a handful of bent nails, mending a fence post that had leaned into the wind one time too many. Sweat darkened his shirt at the shoulders, trickled down the scarred line of his jaw, and stung his eyes. It was only when he straightened and looked toward the horizon that he noticed the change. The sky had taken on a bruised cast. Black clouds thickened over the mountains, rolling down in uneven sheets, as though the heavens were closing a fist. The air stilled. The usual drone of cicadas ceased, and even the sparrows that nested in the eaves of the barn had gone silent. Jonah frowned, setting his tools aside. For a moment, he thought it was fatigue, the heat making him dizzy. But then the earth shifted under his boots so slight, he wondered if it had been imagination. Shadow felt it too. The great black stallion, tied loosely to a post nearby, raised his head with a sharp snort. His ears pricked forward, then back, his nostrils widening as though he scented danger on the invisible wind. He pawed at the ground, stamping hard enough to rattle the dust, then tossed his head, eyes showing white. "Easy boy," Jonah muttered, running a hand across his brow. He looked back to the horizon where the clouds swelled darker. "It's just a change in the weather." But the words felt thin even as he spoke them. Something was wrong. Something deeper than weather. It came with a roar. At first it was a low, grinding rumble, as if the mountain itself were turning in its sleep. Then, with no warning, the ground lurched beneath Jonah's feet. The barn shuddered violently. Rafters groaned and cracked, the roof timbers shaking like brittle bones. Dust rained from the beams in gritty showers. Jonah staggered, clutching the post to keep himself upright. His injured legs screamed in protest, pain shooting up through muscle and scar. Behind him, shadows screamed too, a wild, piercing whinny that cut through the rising thunder. The horse fought his rope muscles, bunching hooves striking sparks against stone. The quake grew worse. Boards split. The floor buckled under Jonah's boots, and the earth itself seemed to roll like the deck of a ship on storm seas. From the slopes above came the crack and clatter of falling rock stones tumbling down in a deadly rattle. Jonah forced himself to stand straight, a voice rising above the chaos. "Hold Shadow steady now, steady." But Shadow was beyond reason. The animal's terror was as raw as the ground convulsing beneath them. Jonah lunged for the rope, trying to calm him. But another violent jolt ripped the earth sideways, and Jonah fell to one knee, teeth grinding as pain lanced through the old wound. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shaking slowed. The earth groaned once more, then seemed to sigh into stillness. Jonah remained crouched, panting, waiting for it to start again. The barn creaked ominously, half its weight shifted off its foundation. The smell of dust and splintered pine filled the air. And then came the wind. At first, just a hiss-sharp dry sliding over the desert floor. Then it rose into a howl. Jonah turned toward the open land beyond the barn and froze. A wall was coming. From the far side of the valley, a curtain of sand higher than the barn itself rolled forward like a tidal wave, turned to earth. It devoured the moonlight, turned the sky a churning yellow-brown, and hissed louder than rain. Jonah's breath caught. The sandstorm moved with unnatural speed, as though the quake had ripped open some buried fury. "God help us," he muttered. The wind hit first, a screaming gale that ripped shingles from the barn and slammed Jonah backward. His eyes filled with grit, and his mouth caught a mouthful of bitter sand. The barn's metal roof screeched, a single sheet tearing free and cartwheeling into the night. Boards snapped, nails squealed from wood. Jonah dragged himself upright, pulling his collar over his mouth. Already the air was thick enough to choke, each breath scraping like sandpaper against his throat. Shadow was half mad now, jerking against the rope, the whites of his eyes rolling wildly. The horse reared rope, snapping taut. The post trembled in its socket. Jonah tried to move closer, raising his hands. "Easy, Shadow, easy." But the next gust slammed into the barn like a fist. A beam cracked overhead and dropped splinters across the dirt. Shadow's shrieked eyes blazing. With one last lunge, the rope broke free. The thick wood post splintered, snapping in two. Shadow Jonah reached for him, but the stallion was already moving, crashing through the half-open barn door, shouldering it wide in his panic. He was a streak of black muscles swallowed by the storm. For one last instant, Jonah saw the sweep of his tail, felt the thunder of his hooves, and then nothing. The desert ate him whole. The sound of hoofbeats dwindled quickly, smothered under the roar of wind. Jonah staggered after him, arm raised to shield his eyes. The storm struck with the full force of 1,000 knives. Sand whipped against his skin, sharp enough to draw blood, cutting into the exposed flesh of his hands and face. His coat flapped violently, nearly torn from his back. "Shadow," he bellowed, voice raw, but the storm swallowed the sound like it was nothing. Each step was torture. The limp in his leg worsened until every movement sent shards of fire up through his hip. He stumbled forward blindly, eyes stinging tears mixing with grit. His lungs clawed for air, but each breath only filled them with more sand. Still, he pressed on his body, bent against the gale. Somewhere ahead, maybe near, maybe miles away, his horse ran blind through the chaos. The thought of Shadow alone, terrified, cut Jonah deeper than any wound. This wasn't just an animal. It was the only living soul tethering him to the world. To lose him would be to lose the last proof Jonah hadn't already vanished. He pressed forward, straining to see the faint imprints of hooves. They blurred and vanished almost as quickly as the wind erased them. He bent low, fingers scraping the ground, coughing, calling again, "Shadow, shadow." But the desert did not answer. Jonah stumbled, knees giving way, pitching him into the sand. His mouth filled with grit, choking him, and he rolled onto his side, coughing until bile rose. Still, he forced himself up, staggering another few feet. Each time he tried to run, his leg betrayed him, dropping him hard to the ground. Time lost all meaning. He shouted until his throat was raw, clawed forward until his nails cracked. Each cry for his horse was fainter than the last, blown to nothing by the endless howl. Finally, he could go no farther. Jonah collapsed, chest-heaving arms, trembling with exhaustion. He knelt in the sand head, bowed, his whole body shaking. The storm screamed overhead, a deafening reminder of his failure. Shadow was gone. Jonah sat there, sand piling around him, breath coming in shallow bursts. For the first time in years, he felt not the dull ache of being forgotten, but the sharp, searing pain of losing the one thing he had left. His hands dug into the ground, as if he could claw back the tracks the storm had stolen. But there was nothing. No tracks, no sound, no horse. Only the endless roar of wind and the empty desert stretching into darkness. The storm had ended as suddenly as it had come, leaving the desert broken and raw in its wake. For hours, the wind had screamed, stripping paint from stone, tearing shrubs out by the roots. Now silence pressed down across Nevada like a heavy hand. The air was still unnervingly so, and the only movement came from the slow drift of sand settling into new shapes. The desert floor was no longer the same. Dunes had shifted, ravines deepened, rocks unearthed. It looked like a land remade by violence, scarred into something alien. Jonah Mercer stumbled through it with his head bowed and his lips cracked into painful fissures. His eyes burned bloodshot from 2 days of dust. He had not slept. He had barely eaten, and what little water he'd found had been scooped from a shallow stone depression, brackish and tasting of iron. Each swallow left him thirstier than before. For 2 days he searched. He searched when the sun burned the white over the horizon and when the desert glowed red at dusk. He searched until the limp in his leg had become a constant knife, stabbing deeper with every mile. He followed what he thought might be hoof prints, only to have them erased by the faintest breath of wind. Again and again, hope rose, only to be swept away with the sand. "Maybe you're gone," he muttered hoarsely, staring into the endless wasteland. His voice was like gravel ground under a boot. "Maybe I lost you, Shadow. And there's nothing left for me now." The words tasted of defeat. He pressed on regardless, because to stop would be to admit there was nothing left worth moving for. His thoughts circled endlessly, circling the same truth without the horse, without that one creature who had chosen to stay by his side. Jonah Mercer was nothing but a ghost adrift in the desert. By the evening of the second day, his body could endure no more. The sun was sinking bleeding color across the western horizon. The mountains stood black and jagged against a sky the color of fire. Jonah collapsed at the base of a low cliff, back pressed to stone, still warm from the day's heat. His chest heaved, each breath shallow and painful, as though a great weight pressed down on him. He wiped grit from his mouth with a trembling hand, but the effort exhausted him further. The desert around him was silent, save for the faint hiss of cooling sand. It felt like the silence of a grave. He closed his eyes. "Maybe this is it," he whispered. The words drifted into the dry air and vanished. A nameless man dying in the dust. Nobody to care. Nobody to know. Tears welled, stinging against the grit crusting his skin. He hadn't cried in years. Now they slipped down his dirt-streaked face, leaving narrow, clean lines across his cheeks. He swallowed hard and raised his head just once more, forcing the last of his broken voice into the air. Shadow. The sound cracked fragile, a prayer without faith. At first there was nothing. Then, faint, distant, almost mistaken for wind, came the answering call. A whinny. Low and raw, but unmistakably equine. Jonah's eyes snapped open. He held his breath, every muscle rigid. His mind raced hallucination. The desert playing cruel tricks on a half-dead man. He waited, heart hammering so hard it drowned the silence. And then it came again. Clearer this time. A shrill, rising cry that echoed off the cliffs, the voice of a horse. Shadow. Strength surged into Jonah's bones as if poured from the sky. He staggered upright, pain screaming in his leg, but he barely noticed. He lurched forward, half stumbling, half running toward the sound. The world tilted, blurred, but he clung to the direction of that cry like a drowning man clinging to rope. He rounded a rise of stone and stopped dead. There, emerging from the haze of lingering dust, stood the silhouette he had feared never to see again. Massive shoulders, tangled mane whipping in the breeze, eyes glinting like fire. Shadow Jonah breathed, voice breaking. The stallion whinnied this time, strong and insistent, and broke into a trot. Sand sprayed beneath his hooves as he closed the distance. Jonah's knees buckled and he dropped arms outstretched. Shadow circled him once, shaking his mane, then pressed close, warm breath huffing against Jonah's hair. Jonah buried his face against the horse's neck, inhaling the mingled scents of sweat and dust. His arms wrapped around that thick, powerful neck as if he could anchor himself forever there. "Thank God. You're alive." I thought his voice cracked. He pressed his forehead to the stallion's shoulder, unable to finish. "I thought I'd lost you." Shadow nickered softly and pressed his head into Jonah's chest, nudging firmly, as though reminding him he was solid here, unbroken. Jonah's eyes burned again, but this time it was not from the sand. The two of them stood there in the desolate silence, man and beast, clinging to one another, survivors bound by something deeper than ownership. Jonah had thought himself emptied of feeling, yet in that moment his heart swelled with relief, so sharp it was almost pain. When at last he pulled back, wiping his face with a grit-stained sleeve, he tried to coax the horse toward the direction of the barn. "Come on, Shadow. Let's go home. We've had enough of this damn desert." But Shadow did not move. Instead, the horse pawed the ground hard enough to kick up sand, then jerked his head toward the dark mouth of a nearby canyon. His ears pointed forward, his gaze locked. "No," Jonah said, shaking his head. "Not that way. We're done. We're going back." He tugged lightly at the mane, but Shadow resisted, stomping his hooves again, tossing his head with sudden, sharp defiance. Then came a short, urgent whinny, nothing like his usual tones. His eyes blazed amber in the last light of sunset, demanding attention. "What is it?" Jonah muttered, unsettled. He followed the line of Shadow's gaze toward the black cut in the stone where the canyon split. The place looked like the throat of some vast beast, waiting to swallow anyone foolish enough to enter. Jonah's instinct screamed to turn away. Safety lay in the opposite direction, back to the barn, to shelter to what little life he knew. Yet Shadow did not yield. The stallion turned toward the canyon, took several deliberate steps forward, then stopped and glanced back. He snorted, ears pinned forward. Jonah stared, unease prickling his skin. Shadow had never behaved like this before. This was not fear. This was purpose. "You want me to follow you?" Jonah asked softly. Shadow stamped once loud in the quiet desert, then turned again toward the canyon. His body language was unmistakable, not a beast fleeing danger, but a guide pointing the way. Jonah exhaled slowly. His entire body trembled with exhaustion, every instinct telling him to turn back. And yet, in Shadow's eyes, he saw something more. Not desperation, but certainty. He stood there a long moment, the dying sun bleeding across the sky, the desert holding its breath. Then Jonah nodded. "All right," he whispered. His voice cracked, but conviction steadied it. "I'll trust you. One more time." And so, after 2 days of hell, Jonah Mercer gathered the last of his strength and stepped forward. The canyon grew narrower the deeper they pressed into it. Jonah had thought the first stretch difficult, but this was worse, like the earth itself had been cleaved apart and then left to rot. Shadow moved with deliberate patience, each step careful, his great hooves clattering against loose stone. Jonah leaned low against the stallion's side, when the path constricted, his shoulders scraping the rock wall, while Shadow squeezed through. The trail wound downward, always downward, littered with shards of stone and twisted roots that had forced their way through cracks in the cliff. Some sections had collapsed entirely, leaving only precarious ledges coated with loose sand. Each time Shadow set his weight, small cascades of grit and pebbles spilled into the abyss, bouncing and echoing into a darkness Jonah could not see the bottom of. Sweat plastered Jonah's shirt to his back, despite the cooling evening air. He kept one fist clenched in the coarse reins, knuckles white, ready to yank the stallion back if the ground gave way. His limp made the climb harder. Every unstable step sent pain lancing up his thigh. The thought of slipping here, breaking a leg where no soul could find him, gnawed at the back of his mind. Yet Shadow never faltered. The horse's gait was calm, steady as if he had walked this broken passage 100 times before. He set his weight, firmly tested the ground, and carried his rider down with the same confidence he might have shown crossing a flat meadow. Jonah found himself trusting the animal's instincts more than his own, leaning into that strength. "You know where you're going," Jonah muttered through clenched teeth, voice nearly lost in the canyon silence. "Better than I do." After what felt like hours, the canyon walls began to widen. Jonah noticed first a shift in the light, a pale glow spilling down from somewhere ahead. He raised his head, blinking against the dust, and then the path spilled out into open space. Jonah drew Shadow to a halt. His breath caught in his throat. The canyon walls fell away, revealing a valley hidden in the bones of the mountains. It was as if the earth had cracked open and then sealed itself, trapping a piece of the desert within. The basin stretched wide, bowl-shaped, enclosed on all sides by cliffs of stone and sand piled like fortifications. And it was silent. Not the natural silence of open land, but something deeper. The kind of silence that pressed down on the skin, made the hairs on Jonah's arms stand on end. There was no wind, no insects, not even the faint scrape of sand shifting. The world here felt frozen, untouched for centuries. The ground was coated in a blanket of red dust that dulled every shape. Cracks split the earth like veins, jagged and dry, leading nowhere. A few dead bushes rose like skeletal fingers, brittle branches reaching upward in futile grasp. Jonah swallowed hard, his tongue thick in his mouth. "Jesus," he whispered. His voice sounded alien, and the stillness swallowed almost instantly. "This place, it's not on any map." He guided Shadow a few steps forward. The stallion's hooves struck the earth with dull thuds, each impact echoing strangely, as though the ground were hollow. Jonah glanced at the cliffs that circled the basin. Massive boulders leaned together in unnatural piles, as though a landslide had once poured down and sealed the valley off from the world above. Sunlight filtered weakly through fissures in the cliffs high overhead. The beams fell in fractured shafts, painting the valley floor in long slashes of pale gold. Where the light struck the dust, it shimmered faintly, as if reluctant to reveal what lay beneath. Jonah rubbed at the sweat on his brow and found his hand shaking. Every step Shadow took seemed too loud. The echoes didn't ring out, and they sank absorbed into the earth itself, leaving behind a resonance that made Jonah's stomach twist. He had felt battlefields go quiet after artillery barrages, but even that silence had been filled with the weight of the dead. This silence was stranger, older. Shadow, however, seemed unfazed. His ears twitched, his gaze sweeping steadily ahead, but there was no panic in his movements. He walked as though this valley belonged to him, or at least as though he knew it was where they were meant to be. Jonah's throat tightened. Instinct screamed at him to turn back to leave this place, before whatever it held showed itself. He shifted in the saddle gaze, flicking back toward the slit of canyon behind them, the only exit now distant, small, already narrowing with the gathering shadows. He wanted to leave. God, he wanted to. But curiosity, that old soldier's itch for answers, burned hotter. He had stumbled into a mystery buried beneath the desert, something no man had likely seen before. And Shadow. Shadow was certain. Jonah looked down at the horse, who carried himself with an almost regal calm. He exhaled shakily and patted the muscled neck. "You know something I don't," he said, the words catching on the dry air. He hesitated, then nodded, his voice rough with surrender. "All right, boy. I'll trust you. Lead on." The decision felt monumental, heavier than it should have been. It was as though, in choosing to follow, he had stepped across an invisible threshold, one that might never allow him back. A faint breeze stirred then the first hint of movement in the air since he had entered the valley. It carried a low whistle, a sound like a whisper threading through the stones. Jonah's stiffened head, snapping up. He turned in the saddle, looking back. The canyon they had passed through was a thin crack of light, now distant and shrinking, the outside world reduced to a pale smear against the encircling walls. Ahead lay only the vast, hollow, empty and waiting shadows, pooling thick across the floor as the sun sank. The silence was so complete, it felt alive, as if the valley itself were holding its breath. In the center of the basin lay something vast, half buried beneath the red sand. A curve of metal arched out of the ground, smooth and seamless, catching the light of the rising moon. Jonah blinked hard, rubbed at his eyes with the back of a dusty hand. But the sight remained. It was no rock, no ruin. It was a disk. Dozens of meters across, the thing stretched in both directions, its circumference lost beneath layers of sand and rubble, as though the desert had tried to swallow it whole. Only half of the structure remained visible, an enormous curve of silver gray that gleamed faintly through its shroud of dust. Debris lay scattered across it, jagged rocks, drifts of sand-scrub trees bleached and dead. At a distance, it looked almost like a grave, a giant coffin smothered by time. Jonah's breath left him in a single, hard exhale. He stopped walking, staring at the impossible bulk. His pulse hammered in his ears. "No," his voice cracked. "That's not ours. No way in hell." Shadow snorted sharply behind him, pawing at the ground. The stallion's ears flicked back, then forward again, nostrils flaring as he tasted the air. His muscles quivered, caught between alarm and fascination. The sound of his hoof striking the earth echoed flat and dull, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Jonah swallowed and forced himself to take another step. He had seen machines in his time, helicopters, transports, fighters streaking across foreign skies. He knew the language of rivets and seams of welded joints and patched plates. But this was different. The curve was too perfect, the sheen too clean, even beneath its centuries of burial. It looked less like a man-made craft and more like some enormous stone, polished by water, except it was metal, and it pulsed faintly under the moon's cold light. His mind groped for explanations. An old military experiment, a secret bomber project abandoned in the desert. Maybe some Cold War prototype that had gone wrong. Yet the longer he looked, the less sense it made. The proportions were alien. The surface showed no bolts, no joints, no lines where panels met. It was all one impossible piece. Jonah licked his dry lips. His throat felt tight. "This isn't us," he whispered. This is something else." Fear gnawed at him. He wanted to turn away, to drag Shadow back through the canyon and never return. But curiosity burned hotter than fear, pulling him forward. His boots sank into the red dust as he walked, and each step measured, unwilling but unstoppable. Shadow resisted when Jonah tugged the reins. The horse tossed his head and stamped, refusing to advance further. Jonah ran a calming hand down the animal's neck, but Shadow would not be coaxed. His ears pinned flat, his massive body tense as drawn wire. Jonah let the reins fall slack. "Stay here," he murmured. "I'll go." He moved on foot, the silence of the valley pressing in around him. The closer he drew, the more he saw. The metal's surface wasn't metal as he knew it. It had the uncanny sheen of water, frozen solid, a faint luminescence, glowing pale green wherever the moonlight struck. Jonah reached out, half against his will, until his fingers brushed it. The shock jolted through him. It was freezing cold, colder than any steel should have been after hours beneath the desert sun. The chill bit into his skin, sinking deep into his bones. He pulled back sharply, goose flesh rising across his arms. What in God's name? He steadied the flashlight in his other hand and swept the beam across the curve. The light didn't reflect the way it should. Instead, it seemed to sink into the surface, illuminating faint lines that spiderwebbed through the material. Jonah squinted. At first, he thought they were scratches. Then he realized they were deliberate. The patterns were too precise, curling and intersecting like veins of silver and stone. They glimmered faintly, as though the beam had awakened them. Strange symbols, maybe writing, maybe circuitry etched across the hull in a language he couldn't begin to fathom. He circled slowly, boots crunching in the dust. At the far side, half hidden beneath a fall of sand and broken rock, he found it a depression, oval-shaped, just large enough for a man to stand in. He leaned closer, brushing aside dirt. The outline of a hatch revealed itself, its edges smooth and perfect, unlike any door he had ever seen. A narrow seam remained exposed, wedged slightly ajar, as though some violent impact had forced it loose. From that crack issued a faint breath of air, cold metallic tinged with ozone. The smell made Jonah's skin crawl, reminding him of burnt wiring and lightning strikes. He pulled back, coughing, then pressed his sleeve against his mouth. Shadow whinnied sharply from across the basin, his voice cutting like a warning. Jonah turned his head. The horse's eyes glinted pale in the dark, his body poised as though ready to bolt. Jonah tightened his grip on the flashlight. He stepped into the shallow depression, bracing himself against the strange hull. His palms stung with cold as he pressed into the seam. Nothing. He backed away, glancing around, then grabbed a length of twisted scrap metal from the rubble. It might have been part of the valley's collapse, a bent rod of rebar or something older rusted through. He jammed it into the gap and levered hard. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan that resonated through the hull, the seam gave way. Dust cascaded down as the hatch shifted, opening enough to leave a dark slit wide enough for a man to slip through. A wave of frigid air rolled out, washing over him, erasing the hair on his arms and neck. He staggered back, heart thudding. The smell of ozone deepened, mixed now with something older, sour like metal left to rot in rain. Jonah turned his head toward the horse. Shadow stood rigid at the far edge of the basin, ears pinned back, staring with unblinking intensity. Jonah swallowed, lifted the flashlight, and whispered hoarsely, "Wait for me here, old friend. I have to see what this is." Jonah steadied his breath, tightened his grip on the flashlight, and ducked through. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The temperature dropped like he had stepped into a winter storm. His breath came out in a fog that clung to the beam of light. The smell was worse inside, metal sharpness mingled with ozone and the faint tang of stagnant water. He wrinkled his nose, but it filled his lungs all the same, thick and electric. His boots echoed on a floor that curved under him in ways that unsettled the eye, as if gravity itself wasn't quite right here. Each step produced a hollow metallic note that bounced and multiplied until he could have sworn another set of footsteps matched his own. He swung the flashlight over his shoulder, chest tight. Nothing. Only the smooth, seamless corridor, stretching away, walls glistening faintly as though covered in frost. He pressed on. The passage widened and then opened suddenly into a vast chamber. Jonah froze on the threshold, his mouth falling open. The space was a half-sphere larger than the interior of any aircraft he had ever seen. Its ceiling arched high above a smooth dome, traced with veins of faint light, like lightning captured in glass. They pulsed in slow rhythms, sickly green, glowing just enough to outline the chamber. At the center sat a control platform, a long, low structure more like a reclining bench than a chair. It sloped at an angle that made Jonah's skin crawl. Whatever had been meant to sit there, it was not built for human proportions. He swept the flashlight across the room, expecting levers, gauges, dials, something familiar. There was nothing. No switches, no panels, no machinery he could name. Just surfaces, clean, featureless planes that caught and bent the light strangely. He felt both awe and dread rise inside him. This was a cockpit, a nerve center, but it looked as though it had been designed by something that did not need hands. Jonah's boots rang sharply as he moved toward the walls. Then he noticed them. Symbols. They stretched in long lines across the curving surface, geometric shapes, loops, spirals, each glowing faintly like embers buried in ash. He stared, pulse quickening. When he drew closer, the glow intensified, the shapes burning more brightly as though stirred awake by his presence. Jonah stopped in his tracks, throat dry. "They see me," he whispered hoarsely. "God help me. They know I'm here." For the first time, he felt the craft not as a machine, but as something alive, or at least remembering life. It was as though he had intruded upon an ancient intelligence dreaming in the dark. A narrow corridor opened on the far side of the dome. Jonah hesitated, then forced himself forward, ducking into the passage. His light revealed another chamber, smaller, lined with curved racks that rose like ribs. They were empty now, dusted with crystalline frost, but their design suggested they had once held something. Equipment, perhaps, or bodies. He tried not to think about the latter. At the far end stood a pedestal thick and angular, supporting an object that stole his breath. A crystal. It was the size of a barrel, perfectly transparent, yet glowing faintly from within, with a gentle blue radiance. The surface was smooth, as if water had frozen into flawless glass. Jonah stepped closer, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Inside, the glow bent and refracted, revealing shifting shapes. For a moment, he thought it was only the distortion of light. Then he realized there was something within. He pressed his face close to the crystal. The interior was filled with faint lines of illumination, branching and pulsing faintly, like veins of light rather than blood. They coiled around a shape that refused to resolve, part machine, part organic, caught between the outline of a device and the form of a creature curled in sleep. Jonah's heart pounded. He licked his cracked lips, whispering, "What are you? A machine? Or a body?" The thing inside did not move. Yet the aura it gave off, cold, electric, powerful, rolled over him in waves. His body quivered, but his eyes would not leave it. Fear wrestled with fascination, and fascination won. His free hand lifted slowly, trembling as it rose. He could hear his own breath rasping, the blood thundering in his ears. Then his palm pressed against the crystal. The shock was instant. The chamber shuddered. The walls around him lit up in a blaze of sigils. Light raced along the grooves, flooding into the cockpit dome beyond. Jonah gasped and tried to pull his hand away, but some invisible force held it there, pinning his palm against the ice-smooth surface. Cold surged up his arm, stabbing through nerves, shooting into his chest. God. The word tore from him, cut short by a flash of searing light. The symbols along the walls blazed searing lines of emerald and blue, filling the dome with a glow that felt more like a storm than illumination. The veins in the crystal pulsed wildly. The air grew thick, humming with energy. And then the ceiling came alive. Light erupted overhead, not flat, but three-dimensional, shimmering into shapes that hung in the air. Jonah's eyes widened as he watched stars form out of the glow, pinpricks of white suspended in the dome. They spun slowly, aligning into a galactic map, spirals of light curling outward. Planets flickered, coalesced, shifted. It was not words, but pure vision, a language of sight and sensation. A deep sound reverberated through the chamber, not heard with ears, but felt in bone. Jonah staggered, clutching his head. The images poured into him, a great vessel slipping between stars. Storms of cosmic radiation battering its hull. A collision with fire and rock. Darkness swallowing everything. He gasped, stumbling backward, eyes wide. They were showing him memory, the ship's last journey, its final days before the valley became its tomb. The vision flared brighter, then snapped away. The light dimmed, leaving him shaking in the afterglow. Jonah blinked rapidly, heart racing, chest heaving. He turned back to the crystal, horror and awe mingling in equal measure. A fine crack now traced its surface, glowing faintly with energy leaking through. A sound like ice splintering filled the chamber. Jonah stumbled back, raising the flashlight, as though it could protect him. No. I didn't mean. His words broke into ragged breaths. He had touched something sacred and broken it. The symbols on the walls dimmed, but did not die. They lingered, glowing faintly, as though waiting. The air buzzed with a current he could still feel under his skin. Jonah pressed a hand to his chest, trying to steady his pounding heart. Sweat chilled instantly on his skin in the frigid air. He stared at the cracked crystal, trembling, understanding with terrible clarity that he had opened a door. A door that could never be shut again. His voice was a whisper, barely audible, even to himself. This is beyond everything we've ever known. Jonah left the valley before dawn, Shadow's steady hooves carrying him across the broken desert floor. The hatch, the crystal, the visions, he carried them in his chest, like a second heartbeat. Every time he closed his eyes, the galaxy spun again in his mind. Spirals of stars and worlds so far beyond Nevada, they might as well have been dreams. Yet, it hadn't been a dream. The cold of that crystal still lingered in his skin. Back in the barn, he tried to rest. He couldn't. He lay awake staring at the warped rafters, sweat prickling despite the night's chill. Every blink brought back the same flicker of alien symbols glowing brighter as if waiting for him to return. Shadow stamped restlessly in the straw ears, twitching toward shadows no one else could see. The horse's unease mirrored his own. Jonah ran a hand over his face and whispered into the dark, "Do I keep it to myself? Or tell someone?" There was no answer. Only Shadow's breath, slow and rough, filling the silence. By the following evening, Jonah could bear it no longer. He saddled Shadow and rode toward the border town, a lonely strip of neon and dust clinging to the highway. The kind of place truckers and wanderers paused in for a drink before disappearing into the dark again. The bar sat half sunk in its own shadow, a rusted sign buzzing erratically above the door. Inside, smoke curled thick as curtains. Neon lights sputtered above dented tables. The smell was beer gone sour, whiskey spilt too many times, sweat baked into leather. Jonah slipped into the back, keeping his hat low, and found the corner table where an ancient computer sat abandoned. The thing whirred and coughed. When he pressed the power button, its fan rattling like an old man's lungs. He stared at the screen a long time before opening the browser. His fingers hovered over the keys, stiff with hesitation. He had always been careful, never spoke too much in town, never left tracks deeper than necessary. But tonight, caution bowed to obsession. He created a new account. Username Desert Witness. The name felt strange, like confessing. The words poured slowly at first, then faster. He wrote of what he had seen, a massive disk buried in a hidden valley, half sunk in red desert dust. He described the hull, smooth, seamless, faintly glowing, and the strange symbols that burned brighter when he drew near. He mentioned the crystal chamber, though vaguely calling it a device that pulsed with its own energy. He avoided the location. He avoided his name. He ended with a single question. Has anyone else ever heard of something like this? His thumb lingered over the key. His heart thudded like a drum. Then he pressed send. The screen flickered, refreshed, and there it was, his confession cast into the digital void. The responses came faster than he'd expected. Within the hour, comments stacked below his post. Most were dismissive. Photoshop. Roswell all over again. Another cool story, bro. Put down the bottle. Jonah's jaw tightened, but he kept reading. Amid the noise, some voices were quieter, more serious. A user speculated about black-budget aerospace projects. Another mentioned old crash rumors experimental bombers never admitted to. One quoted Roswell documents. Jonah leaned closer, pulse steadying. Some of them believed, or at least wanted to. For the first time since he'd left the valley, he felt less alone. And then, buried among the replies, came one that froze him. It was simple, written with calm precision. What you describe matches records I've chased for years. Contact me. The username was Clara V. Jonah frowned, clicked. A brief profile unfolded. Dr. Clara Voss, astronomer, author of 3 books on stellar cartography. He scrolled further articles accusing her of obsession, of ruining her career with pseudoscience. She had written about unidentified aerial phenomena, linking them with ancient data. The mainstream had ridiculed her. She had vanished from academia's circle. Jonah's lips pressed tight. A disgraced scientist was still a scientist, and she hadn't laughed. A private message notification blinked. He opened it. "If you truly saw what you described, we must talk. I believe you. You are not alone." Jonah exhaled, staring at the words until they blurred. He whispered, "Not alone." Minutes ticked by before he dared reply. His fingers hesitated, then began to type. He told her of the crystal, the glowing symbols, the sudden visions of stars and storms of the ship's final journey. He wrote in blunt phrases the way soldiers reported after battle. No embellishment, no poetry. Just fact. Her response came swiftly measured. "That aligns with theories I've studied. Some call it extraterrestrial memory technology devices capable of storing experience itself. If you are describing what I think you are, it is the most significant find in human history. If you are willing, I can help you bring this to light. Carefully, but publicly. We cannot let it vanish into silence again." Jonah sat back, the chair creaking under him. His throat felt tight. Someone believed him, not with mocking disbelief, not with fear, but with knowledge. His chest warmed a strange, forgotten feeling. Trust. The warmth shattered when the screen blinked again. 2 new messages. No profile pictures, no history. The first read, "Do not interfere. This is a matter of national security." The second, "Forget it, Mercer. Walk away or you'll regret it." Jonah stiffened. His name. His real name, not Desert Witness. His hands trembled above the keys. Someone was watching. He glanced around the smoky bar, heart pounding. Truckers hunched over their beers. A pair of ranch hands argued by the jukebox. No one looked his way, but that meant nothing. He turned back to the screen. Clara's message still glowed, steady, unwavering. "I believe you. Let me help." His breath came hard. He wiped a hand over his mouth. The threats pulsed in his vision, cold and sharp. But another voice rose louder inside him. If he stayed silent, the craft would remain buried, lost to secrecy, erased like so many other truths. His whole life had been silence. Forgotten battles? A forgotten man. He clenched his jaw. "No more," he muttered. Jonah placed his fingers back on the keys, ignoring the sweat slicking his palms. He typed his reply to Clara, choosing trust over fear, connection over solitude. The decision was dangerous. He knew that. But for the first time in decades, Jonah Mercer felt like his voice mattered. And he would not let them bury it again. The desert afternoon was slipping toward dusk when Jonah rode Shadow back to the barn. The sky was awash in faded orange, the sun lowering behind the jagged Nevada ridges. Shadow halted before the barn head, lifting sharply. His ears twitched, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Jonah frowned and ran a palm down the stallion's neck. The horse's muscles were taut, his breath sharp. "What is it, boy?" Jonah murmured. Then he saw it. Far off on the dirt road that rarely saw more than a pickup or two in a month, a plume of dust rose in the still air. Jonah squinted. A car, black, sleek, and utterly wrong for this barren stretch. The sun caught on its polished body, turning it into a dark shard gliding across the land. The vehicle rolled to a stop in front of the sagging barn. The sound of the engine died, leaving only the settling tick of hot metal. 2 men stepped out, their black suits already powdered gray with desert grit. Their shoes sank awkwardly into the dust city leather, sinking in soil that had never been meant for it. The sight was surreal, 2 corporate crows landing in a wasteland. Jonah's chest tightened. He stayed where he was, one hand brushing Shadow's mane, waiting. The taller of the two adjusted his cuffs before speaking. His voice was deep, resonant, each word pronounced with practiced clarity. "Mr. Mercer, we've been looking for you." Jonah said nothing. The other man was leaner, his gaze sharper, flicking across the barn, the horse, the ridgeline, the desert beyond. His eyes were restless, cataloging, dissecting. Together they made an odd pair, one the immovable stone, the other the probing blade. The tall one stepped forward. "I am Agent Kane. This is Agent Sutter. We represent the Department of Scientific Security." He let the name hang in the air, as though it should mean something. "We believe you've come across a certain object. We are here to collect it," Shadow answered before Jonah could. The stallion flared his nostrils, ears pinned flat, a low rumble rising deep in his chest. He stamped once, then again, the ground trembling under the force. His mane bristled like a wolf's, hackles, eyes burning in the wan light. Kane's brows pinched ever so slightly. Sutter took half a step back, his calculating gaze faltering. Jonah pressed a calming hand against Shadow's neck, but the horse's fury was unshakable. It was as though he had scented the truth beneath their polite words. "Easy," Jonah murmured, though his own gut echoed Shadow's warning. Sutter recovered, slipping a leather wallet from his coat and flipping it open with a practiced snap. He extended it just enough for Jonah to see the crest stamped on the card inside. It looked official, gold seal photo, crisp lettering. Jonah leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. The years in uniform had trained him to spot detail faster than instinct. This card was off. The printing was slightly misaligned. The lamination was flat, missing the iridescent shimmer of genuine government issue. A forgery. A good one, but still a forgery. He straightened his expression, unreadable. Inside certainty hardened like stone. Kane must have sensed it. His voice softened, taking on the lilt of reason. "Mr. Mercer, you know as well as I do that you can't keep this thing. Whatever you found, it belongs in the hands of professionals. If you cooperate, this can all remain simple." Sutter's voice cut in sharp and venomous. "That object concerns national security. If you try to withhold it, you put yourself in violation of federal law. Treason, Mr. Mercer. Do you really want to be treated as a traitor?" Jonah looked from one to the other. His weathered face remained blank, his eyes flat and steady. He had heard these voices before, though in different uniforms, commanders issuing ultimatums, officers masking threats as orders. The words hadn't aged well. He shook his head slowly. "I don't have anything for you." The sentence was plain spoken, without heat, but final as a slammed door. Shadow punctuated it with a shrill, defiant whinny. Dust flew as his hooves struck the earth, reverberating like a drumbeat of defiance. Sutter's jaw clenched, his teeth bared in something close to a snarl. Kane remained still, his face unreadable, though his eyes cooled into something harder. A long silence stretched the desert, holding its breath. At last, Kane slipped the false credentials back into his coat pocket. When he spoke, his words were slow, deliberate, as if weighed. "Think carefully, Mr. Mercer. This door we've opened, next time, it will not be with such civility. The choice is yours." He turned without waiting for a response. Dust puffed around his polished shoes as he walked back to the car. Sutter lingered just a moment longer. His eyes narrowed, cutting one last look at Jonah, then at Shadow, who still stood tense as a coiled spring. The agent's lip curled into a thin, humorless smile. "You don't know who you're standing against," he muttered low enough that only Jonah could hear. Then he followed Kane into the sedan. The doors shut with muted thuds, and the engine growled back to life. The car rolled away in a storm of dust, its black gleam shrinking until it vanished into the desert horizon. Jonah stood in the settling silence, his hand still pressed against Shadow's quivering neck. The stallion snorted hard, as if to clear the stench of the strangers from his lungs. Ever since the two men in black suits had stood in the dust outside his barn, he had felt their eyes on him, unseen but constant, like a weight pressing between his shoulders. He knew he was being watched, and he knew what it meant. If he left the ship buried, they would bury him too. If he spoke without proof, his words would vanish into ridicule, just another desert tale told by a bitter drifter. But the crystal, the visions, the chamber, they had been real. And now one chance remained. They want to smother it, he muttered to himself, cinching the straps of his canvas bag. Inside were the only things he trusted: a battered flashlight, a length of rope, a half-empty canteen, and an old army-issue pistol that hadn't been fired in years. But if the world sees it, they can't erase it anymore. Shadow stood nearby, restless, pawing the ground, as if he too understood the weight of what was coming. Jonah laid a hand on the stallion's neck. "You're with me, aren't you, old boy?" Shadow blew a hard breath, snorting dust into the air. Jonah took it as an answer. That night, under a waning moon, man and horse slipped into the desert once more. The path into the valley was no kinder the second time. The canyon walls still pressed tight, jagged edges, throwing warped shadows across the sand. Jonah led Shadow by the reins, his limp making every uneven step a trial. Yet the way was familiar now, etched into his muscles like an old drill. They pushed onward, the silence of the desert, broken only by the crunch of hooves and the scrape of boots. Moonlight draped the cliffs in silver. When they emerged into the basin, Jonah's breath hitched. The buried disk gleamed faintly, its curved surface half revealed, as though the earth itself still wrestled with the idea of surrendering it. The valley seemed even more sealed, more otherworldly under the pale light. Jonah paused, scanning the ridges. He listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no engines. Just the whisper of wind through stone. He released a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding and moved forward. But Shadow halted, muscles stiffening. His ears flicked high, his body quivering with tension. He emitted a deep, uneasy rumble, staring toward the ship. Jonah frowned, flashlight ready. "You hear something, don't you?" The horse pawed the ground, uneasy, but unwilling to back away. Jonah steeled himself and pressed onward. He found a different fissure this time, a narrower crack in the hull he hadn't explored before. The opening was jagged, half concealed by rubble. Jonah wedged himself inside, scraping his shoulders against cold metal until he emerged into a corridor he hadn't seen before. His flashlight beam arced across the walls that curved inward, pressing like a rib cage. The passage led to a smaller chamber. Jonah stepped inside, the echo of his boots striking low and hollow. The space was cluttered with strange fittings, curved as supports like skeletal racks, most of them empty. Dust and frost clung to them, suggesting they had once held cargo or passengers. Jonah's pulse quickened. At the far end, atop a raised platform, sat something that made his heart stop. A box. It was no ordinary box. Roughly the size of a suitcase, its surface gleamed black silver, its edges too perfect, its weight implied by its sheer density. Symbols ran across it in shallow grooves, glowing faintly like embers in the dark. Jonah approached slowly, his flashlight trembling in his grip. He crouched before the box, eyes tracing its lines. No hinge, no latch, no seam where a human hand could force it open. Instead, the etched grooves shone faintly, curving in patterns that reminded him of circuitry or veins of light caught in stone. He set the flashlight down, freeing a hand. His breath caught. When his fingertips brushed the surface, the symbols flared. A soft glow rippled across the box, then dimmed again, as though acknowledging him before sinking back to sleep. Jonah pulled his hand away, heart hammering. "Storage," he whispered. A record, maybe." Hope surged through him, sharp and undeniable. If the crystal had been memory, then this box was proof, physical, undeniable. Something no suit, no government could dismiss. He could already see it, scientists, journalists, cameras flashing, evidence no one could deny. But fear crept in alongside hope. Whoever had chased him knew exactly what they were after. To hold this box was to paint a target squarely on his back. Jonah ran a hand over his face, then lifted the box carefully. It was heavy, heavier than its size suggested, and cold as ice against his chest. He pressed it close, resolve hardening in his gut. This was it. This was what he had come for. He turned toward the corridor, the box clutched to him. That was when the sound hit. A low pulsing thrum that vibrated through the metal walls. Jonah froze, breath caught in his throat. Then recognition stabbed him. He knew that sound. Rotor blades. His face drained of blood. No. The thrum grew louder, building into a roar that filled the valley above. Dust shook loose from the ceiling. From outside came shadows piercing whinny, loud and urgent. Jonah's stomach twisted. They had come. He squeezed through the fissure and pressed himself against the outer hull, peering upward. The sky above the valley blazed with white beams. A black helicopter hovered just over the cliffs, its rotors chopping the air into chaos. No insignia, no markings. Just matte black menace against the moon. Searchlights swept the valley floor, cutting through the dust, illuminating the buried ship in stark, glaring brilliance. The roar of blades drowned everything, a storm of manufactured wind that shook the ground beneath Jonah's boots. He clutched the box tighter, pressing his back against the alien hull. His pulse thundered. Then ropes unfurled from the hovering craft, swinging wildly in the wind. Shapes descended, 6 of them, clad head to toe in black tactical gear. Their helmets gleamed, their rifles bore mounted red lights that glowed like the eyes of hunting predators. One by one, they slid down the ropes, landing with military precision. The dust churned beneath their boots. Their movements were crisp, coordinated. 2 fanned out left, 2 right, weapons raised. Another crouched, scanning the shadows. The leader raised a hand, gesturing toward the massive disc. Target acquired. Jonah pressed his lips into a thin line. His breath swallowed hard, the box heavy as fate in his arms. He understood with icy certainty he wasn't just the witness anymore. He was the quarry. And the hunt had begun. Jonah pressed himself against the cold wall of the buried craft, breath shallow. Through the fractured hull, he could hear them boots pounding on sand, short-clipped commands rattling through radios. The team was moving fast, efficient like wolves circling prey. Red beams cut through the dark, slicing across the ship's curved surfaces, briefly illuminating alien metal before vanishing again. The box in his arms was heavier than stone. Proof, he reminded himself. But it was also a beacon dragging him into the jaws of men who would kill to reclaim it. He could almost hear the old voice in his head, the sergeant from years past. Don't freeze. Make chaos. Move, or you're already dead. Jonah steadied himself. The soldier inside him hadn't died in the desert. He'd only been waiting. He moved quickly, hands searching through the wreck's debris. Broken panels, lengths of cable frayed, and charred shards of plating torn loose in the crash, alien and human wreckage tangled together. He worked by instinct, fingers nimble despite the tremor in them. A piece of plating heavy enough to kill if it dropped. A length of cable strong enough to hold it. a spar of twisted conduit that sparked faintly when scraped. Jonah set the trap at the mouth of a narrow corridor, the heavy plate hoisted with the wire, balanced just right, a set of stripped cables rigged for a flash of sparks when the weight came crashing down. Not a weapon to kill, he had no stomach for that anymore, but enough to rattle them to buy seconds. Seconds meant survival. Sweat beaded on his brow as he tied off the final knot, muttering to himself, "Just a little noise, old man. Enough for you to slip away." He took one last look at the dangling sheet of metal gleaming dully in the red light of his flashlight. Then he slipped back into the shadows. Voices grew nearer. "Clear the east corridor." "Copy. Moving." Two soldiers advanced, rifles sweeping beams, cutting through the dark. Jonah could see their shadows stretching long against the wall, broken by the dangling plate. One reached the wire across the floor. A boot caught. The trigger snapped. The plate crashed down with a metallic scream that echoed like thunder inside the hull. Sparks spat from the rigged cables, crackling against the walls. The blast of noise rattled the chamber, bouncing off the curved surfaces until it sounded like an explosion. The soldiers shouted, stumbling back, one falling hard onto the deck. Blast inside Jonah didn't wait to see the rest. He was already moving, hugging the wall, slipping deeper into the ship's shadow, while confusion rippled through their formation. Outside, another sound erupted, one that pierced even the helicopter's roar, a shrill, furious whinny that seemed to split the night in two. Shadow. Jonah's heart lurched as the stallion's cry echoed through the canyon. A moment later came the thunder of hooves pounding across stone and sand. The sound was wild, deliberate, drawing every ear. From the radio outside came a sharp bark of orders, targets on the move, pursue. Three figures broke from formation, sprinting after the sound of hooves hammering into the narrow cleft at the canyon's edge. Red lights bobbed as they chased into the dark, their boots fading into distance. Jonah swallowed hard. Brave, stubborn beast. Shadow was buying him time. Inside the ship, Jonah tightened his grip on the box and sprinted down a corridor, heart hammering. He remembered a fissure he'd noticed the first time he'd explored, a hairline crack in the hull near the stern, half collapsed, but open enough for a man to squeeze through. He stumbled through twisting passages, the alien geometry pressing in, until he found it a jagged opening, spilling sand and grit where the crash had torn metal apart. The gap was narrow, filled with trickling dust, but it would do. He shoved the box through first, then squeezed after it, his jacket snagging his ribs, scraping raw against the frozen metal. Cursing under his breath, he forced himself through lungs burning until he tumbled onto the outside slope chest, heaving. Sand poured into his collar. Sweat stung his eyes. He clutched the box to him like a lifeline. Shouts rang from the ship's interior. Negative. No target inside. Flashlights slashed the ground nearby. Jonah flattened against the rock, forcing himself still. He rolled down a shallow slope, clutching the box, landing hard on his shoulder, but refusing to let go. Dust rose around him, blinding, choking. Above, a red beam swept across the slope, stopping just shy of where he lay. His chest ached with the effort of silence. His lungs screamed for air, but he pressed his face into the sand and held. Seconds crawled past like hours. The light moved on. Boots crunched elsewhere. Jonah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He was still alive. Barely. He staggered up, legs trembling, and forced himself toward the canyon's edge. Shadow would circle back, he had to. The horse was smarter than any man gave him credit for. And then, as if summoned by desperate hope, the stallion appeared. Out of the shadows, he came, chest-heaving, flanks streaked with dust, but eyes blazing. He had shaken his pursuers and returned as Jonah had known he would. Jonah collapsed against his neck, burying his face in the tangled mane. "You saved me again," he whispered, voice raw. "Damn fool horse. You saved me again." Shadow blew hard, pressing his massive head against Jonah's chest. For a moment, the world shrank to just the two of them, man and beast, clinging to one another in the moonlit dark. Then Jonah looked down at the box. The silver grooves caught the light of the moon, glowing faintly as if alive. He felt its weight not just in his arms, but in his bones. This wasn't victory. It was only escape. And the hunt would not stop here. Jonah lifted his gaze to the canyon rim, where the helicopters still roared, where soldiers still prowled. His jaw tightened. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. He swung into Shadow's saddle, the box cradled tight, and together they slipped back into the desert night. The bar hadn't changed. The same buzzing neon sign sputtered in the window. The same stale fog of smoke clung to the rafters. The jukebox in the corner was still broken, its glass cracked like a dead eye. Jonah Mercer pushed the door open, stepping into the dim light, and scanned the near-empty room. A few long-haul drivers nursed their beers. A couple of ranch hands slumped over cards too tired to cheat. The rest of the tables were ghosts. Jonah chose the corner booth, the one where he had first tapped out his desperate message to strangers on the internet. He sat with his back to the wall, Shadow tethered outside to the hitching rail. The stallion's occasional snort drifted faintly through the walls, a reminder that Jonah wasn't truly alone. The bartender gave him a wary glance, then went back to polishing a glass. Jonah didn't have to wait long. The door swung open again, letting in a slice of desert glare. A woman entered, her figure sharp against the dying light. Mid-50s, perhaps, her frame wiry with travel and years of hard living. Wire-rimmed glasses caught the neon glow, and behind them, her eyes were sharp, hungry, like someone who had spent too long chasing shadows and finally smelled blood. Clara Voss. She walked like someone who had crossed battlefields of a different kind, academic halls, closed-door committees, conference stages that had spat her out in ridicule. And yet, she carried herself upright, with the poise of a woman who had never stopped believing she was right. Jonah rose slightly as she reached the booth. "Your desert witness," she asked. Her voice was low, steady, unadorned by pleasantries. Jonah gave a small nod. "And you're Clara Voss?" She inclined her head once, then slid into the seat across from him. No wasted words, no handshake. Just two exiles meeting in the smoke of a borderland bar. Jonah didn't draw it out. He pulled his coat from the bench beside him, heavy with desert grit, and set it on the table. Beneath the folds of fabric was the box. The black-silver surface caught the neon glow, and for an instant, faint blue patterns shimmered across its etched skin like veins of frozen lightning. Clara inhaled sharply. Her hand hovered above the coat as if she were afraid to touch it. Slowly, reverently, she drew the cloth back. The box sat revealed, humming faintly alien and undeniable. "My God," she whispered. From her satchel, she drew out a small, handheld scanner no bigger than a book. She waved it over the surface. The screen flared alive, jagged spikes tearing across the display. This isn't in any metallurgical database," she murmured. "It's not steel, not titanium. The lattice structure doesn't exist in our periodic models." Her voice broke slightly. "It's not from here." She looked up at Jonah, her eyes wide and bright with awe. "Do you understand what you found?" Jonah's gaze stayed fixed on the box, his weathered face unreadable. "I understand it's the truth, and they'll do everything to bury it again." Clara's hand trembled slightly as she shut off the scanner. She pressed her palm flat against the table to steady herself. "Jonah, this is what I've chased for decades. The proof they always said didn't exist. You've brought me the very thing they ruined my career for. Jonah leaned forward, his voice gravelly but certain. Then help me make sure it doesn't vanish again. Help me make the world see it. Her excitement cooled into something sterner. Clara's expression hardened. You know what they'll do, don't you? They'll come harder. They'll threaten, harass, discredit you. If that fails, they'll take you off the board entirely. Jonah shrugged. They already took everything from me a long time ago. What's left is just this. He tapped the box, and the chance to put it in the light where it belongs. Clara studied him for a long beat, then gave a small, solemn nod. All right, she said. We do this together. I'll call in what allies. I still have scientists outside the system, journalists who can't be bought. We move quickly before they tighten their net. But until then, you hold the location close. We do this smart, or we don't live to do it at all. Jonah extended his scarred hand across the table. Clara clasped it. Two outcasts united by the weight of something larger than themselves. The alliance was forged. Weeks later, the desert floor near the hidden valley hummed with an energy Jonah had never thought he'd see again. Trucks groaned along the dirt track, carrying generators, floodlights, digging equipment. Canvas tents sprouted like pale mushrooms against the red cliffs. Cameras were unpacked tripods, planted cables snaking across the dust. Jonah stood at the ridge shadow at his side, watching the unlikely caravan assemble. For the first time since the war, he felt the thrum of an operation in motion, organized, purposeful, bigger than any one man. Only this time, the cause wasn't conquest. It was revelation. Clara moved among them, her presence commanding. She wore a field jacket instead of a lab coat, her hair tied back, glasses flashing as she directed crews of volunteers, researchers, and a smattering of journalists she trusted. Her words were clipped urgent, but her eyes gleamed with a fire Jonah recognized conviction. Among them was a retired general, gray-haired but still broad-shouldered, who had agreed to lend his name and quiet influence to shield them from the first wave of bureaucratic strikes. Jonah had spoken little to him. The man was another kind of soldier, strategic, political. But his handshake had been firm. Jonah inhaled the dry desert air, cutting his lungs. The valley looked almost alive now. Lights crawling across its face, voices echoing against stone. The battle had begun, and it was not fought with bullets, but with cameras and shovels. Excavation started under the glare of floodlights. Teams with brushes and drills scraped away layers of sand. Crane arms swung cables, tightening, pulling aside boulders that had rested for centuries. Slowly, the ship emerged its hull, catching the beams like silver bone revealed beneath flesh. Gasps rippled through the volunteers each time a new curve surfaced. Photographers clicked furiously, lenses flashing. Journalists whispered into recorders. Jonah remained at the edge, one hand on Shadow's mane, watching the spectacle unfold. Questions bombarded him, but he gave no answers. His eyes stayed hard, his mouth shut. Clara did the talking. "This is not conjecture," she declared into the microphones, her voice steady and strong. "This is evidence. We are not alone, and we have not been for a very long time." Her words echoed across the valley, carried by every lens, every mic. For once, the world would have to listen, and as the night wore on, the ship revealed itself more and more. Its body was nearly intact, scarred, but undeniable, a leviathan raised from centuries of silence. People wept. Others simply stared, jaws slack. Even Jonah, who had already seen it, felt awe stir in him again. The climax of the dig came just as the sun rose over the cliffs. The craft was almost fully uncovered, its scale dwarfing every machine, every human around it. Crews paused, cameras tilted upward, silence falling heavy. Then engines roared. A convoy of SUVs stormed down the dirt road, black paint gleaming dust spiraling in their wake. Tires screeched as they braked hard near the tents. Doors slammed. Jonah's stomach tightened. He recognized the shapes at once. Kane and Sutter stepped into the morning light. Their suits were immaculate, their expressions colder than before. But this time, they were not alone. Soldiers in crisp uniforms flanked them, rifles slung, faces impassive. The air seemed to drop 10 degrees as the black tide swept into camp. Kane carried a thick folder, its edges bristling with paper and seals. His voice cut like a blade as he raised it. By order of the Department of National Security, this excavation ends now. The object you have uncovered is classified state property. You are to cease operations immediately. Silence. Every camera turned. Every microphone swung toward them. Clara stepped forward before Jonah could move. She squared herself against Kane, her chin-high glasses catching the morning sun. "You're too late," she said calmly. Kane's expression darkened. "Dr. Voss, you are violating federal law. You are committing treason against your own country." Clara didn't flinch. Her voice rose firm and resonant, carrying across the crowd and into every live microphone. "You can threaten us, but you cannot silence the truth. This ship does not belong to your department or to any government. It belongs to humanity. To every child who has ever looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone. To every citizen who deserves to know the truth of their own sky." Reporters surged forward, cameras snapping, pens racing. The air vibrated with the frenzy of coverage. Sutter's jaw clenched. He hissed, "Enough. Arrest her." But the soldiers didn't move. Their eyes flicked from Clara, standing unafraid, to the cameras, capturing every twitch of their fingers. They hesitated. Kane saw it. His jaw worked, veins pulsing at his temple. He lowered the folder, slowly snapping it shut with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. His voice was low, seething. "This isn't over." He turned sharply, coat flaring. Sutter lingered a moment longer, glaring daggers at Jonah, then followed. Engines roared again, and the convoy pulled away, leaving behind dust and the electric silence of victory. The crowd erupted, voices shouting, reporters, buzzing, scientists hugging each other in disbelief. Clara stood tall, her shoulders trembling with adrenaline, but her eyes were steady. Jonah moved to her side, shadows stamping the earth behind him. "They'll be back," Jonah murmured. "Yes," Clara answered, watching the SUVs vanish over the ridge. Then she turned toward the cameras. "But now the whole world has seen. They can't bury it anymore." Jonah looked at her, at the ship behind them, at the dozens of witnesses recording every moment. For the first time, he believed her. They had forced the truth into daylight, and there would be no going back. The world changed almost overnight. Clara's voice and the footage of the excavation spread like wildfire. What began as a shaky live stream from a few battered cameras in the Nevada desert exploded across every screen on the planet. Television anchors spoke the words with disbelief, trembling at the edges of their voices. An unidentified craft has been uncovered, not of terrestrial origin. Clips looped endlessly, floodlights raking over silver curves, the ship's strange glyphs glowing faintly against the sand, Clara Voss standing unflinching before government agents in black suits. Her declaration was replayed until it was carved into collective memory. This truth does not belong to any government. It belongs to humanity. Newspapers across continents carried the same headline, translated into dozens of languages: "Alien craft found in Nevada desert." Some governments tried denial. Spokespeople at podiums stammered about hoaxes, about experimental aircraft, about disinformation, but the images could not be contained. The hull's scale, the inscriptions, the crowds of witnesses, all undeniable. And the two men who had haunted Jonah's nights, Kane and Sutter, found themselves stripped of their power. The shadow authority they wielded crumbled under the glare of the cameras. No one cared for their folders stamped classified. No one bowed to their threats when the entire planet was watching. They faded into silence, nameless, in the tide of history, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. For the first time in Jonah Mercer's life, the truth had won. Months passed, and the ship was moved. Under the protection of international agreements hastily drawn and fiercely debated, the craft was transported piece by piece to a new facility. Not a bunker hidden behind razor wire, but a research center built with glass walls and wide public halls where citizens could see with their own eyes the silver leviathan that had slept beneath Nevada's dust for centuries. Children pressed their hands against clear partitions, eyes wide as they stared at the massive hull, the glowing symbols etched like fire across its skin. Families whispered, some in awe, some in fear, but all with the unshakable sense that they were witnessing the opening chapter of a new age. The cracked crystal Jonah had found was displayed at the center of the exhibit. Though fractured, it still pulsed faintly with a soft inner glow. Scholars debated whether it was a memory core, a stasis chamber, or something entirely beyond human understanding. Scientists arrived from across the globe, engineers from Tokyo, physicists from Geneva, linguists from Cairo. They clustered in groups around the glyphs, arguing, scribbling, pointing. For the first time, study was not silenced, but shared. And at the entrance, carved into a simple bronze plaque, were the words, "The Nevada UFO." The first proof that we are not alone, uncovered through the courage of Jonah Mercer and his horse shadow. Humanity did what it always did when faced with revelation. It argued, it dreamed, it feared. Talk shows blazed with debate. Some called the discovery the dawn of a golden age of science, a leap forward into the stars. Others warned of calamity, of alien threats of humanity, unprepared to stare into the vastness above. But underneath the noise ran a common current acceptance. The world could no longer pretend it was alone. Clara Voss, once dismissed and disgraced, became a name uttered with respect. The woman who had stood her ground in the desert became a symbol of tenacity, of vindication, of truth pulled into the light. Invitations flooded her desk, universities, conferences, international panels. She accepted, some declined, most, but she carried herself always with the same fierce clarity. The message was more important than the messenger. And Jonah, his name appeared in headlines. Photographs circulated, grainy shots of him in a weathered coat, his broad shoulders hunched, Shadow's massive form looming beside him. But Jonah himself remained absent. He offered no speeches, granted no interviews. He did not appear at ceremonies. The world might have wanted a hero, but Jonah had never sought to be one. When the noise grew too loud, Jonah slipped away. He rode Shadow back into the desert to the barn he had once called home. He patched the roof where it leaked, mended the fence line, dug out a new trough for water. The place remained humble, half ruin and half refuge, but it was his. Reporters came for a while, their cars raising dust on the dirt road. They tried to bait him with money, with promises of fame. Jonah said little, often nothing at all. Eventually, they stopped coming. The locals began to treat him differently. Where once they had glanced at him with pity or disdain, now they nodded in recognition. Children pointed to him in the market, whispering, "That's the man who found it." Men raised a hand in passing, a quiet salute, not for a soldier, but for a custodian of history. Jonah accepted it without pride, without bitterness. He carried on as he always had, quietly, steadily seeking solace in the desert's silence. One evening, as the sun sank in a blaze of crimson and gold, Jonah saddled Shadow and rode out across the dunes. The stallion's hooves thudded against the sand, sending up clouds that glowed like embers in the fading light. They climbed a tall ridge, the wind tugging at Jonah's coat, Shadow's mane, streaming like a black banner. At the summit, Jonah reined in. The desert stretched endless before them, painted in fire by the dying sun. For a long moment, Jonah simply stared. Then he leaned forward, patting the great horse's neck. His voice was low, almost lost to the wind. "We did it, old friend," he whispered. "We finally gave the truth its place. At last there's room for it in the world." Shadow snorted, pawing the sand, his great chest rising and falling. The sound was strong, resolute, as if the stallion himself answered in agreement. Jonah smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. He felt the words settle not just in the air, but in his bones. For once, the burden he had carried for years, the weight of war, of loss, of exile, lifted. And so Jonah Mercer, forgotten veteran, broken drifter, became something else, a man at peace. The war memories still stirred sometimes in the night, the echo of gunfire, the screams of men. But they no longer consumed him. They were embers fading. What replaced them was silence, not hollow, but whole, the silence of Shadow's steady breathing, the silence of the desert's eternal sky. Jonah did not crave the spotlight, nor did he fear the dark. He had done his part. He had returned a secret meant to be buried into the hands of all mankind. That was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonah closed his eyes. The desert wind brushed against his face, warm and endless. He exhaled slowly, a man finally unshackled from the weight of solitude. No gunfire, no threats, no more men in suits. Just the quiet, the horse at his side, and the knowledge that the truth was safe. And in that quiet, Jonah Mercer found what he had sought all his life, meaning. The story ended not with battle, but with peace. A man and his horse silhouetted against the desert sky, guardians not of power, but of truth.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.